The funeral hadn't even started properly when I felt that something was out of place, as if the air was too heavy to be just sadness. People spoke quietly, but not carefully, but cautiously. I was there, sitting in the front row, hands crossed in my lap, trying to keep myself whole. The coffin in front of me seemed smaller than it should have been for everything it represented. As the priest arranged his papers, I noticed strange movements behind me. It was not consolation that circulated in the room, it was urgency. An urgency that did not match farewell. It was there that my grief began to share space with mistrust. When my son approached, I thought he was going to hug me, maybe say something kind, something that would ring true. Instead, he leaned in and talked about some practical issues that would need to be resolved later. The tone was the same as when I forgot something trivial, as if I were talking to someone unable to understand details. I shook my head, still stunned, and said that we would solve it together. He smiled too quickly and replied that there was no hurry. But there was. I felt it in the way he avoided my eyes. In that instant, I was reduced to someone who needed to be spared from her own life. Shortly after, a man I vaguely recognized, the family's lawyer, I learned later, approached with a thin briefcase in his hands. He spoke to me as one speaks to a tired child, explaining too much, choosing words that are too simple. I said that there was a document, something routine, nothing that required my attention at that moment. When I reached out, ready to sign, my son intervened. He put his hand on the briefcase and said that I didn't have to worry. That this was not the day for that. That I was very shaken. The word was suspended between us, heavy and convenient. I withdrew my hand slowly, more confused than offended at that moment. Part of me wanted to believe that it was care, that it was love trying to express itself in a practical way. But another part, quieter and older, noticed something wrong with the excess of zeal. I looked around and saw my daughter looking away. I saw my sister-in-law whispering to someone near the door. I saw heads agreeing without me having said anything. That was when I understood that that decision had not been improvised. I wasn't being protected. I was being excluded. And no one thought it necessary to warn me. The rest of the ceremony passed as a blur of disconnected voices and memories. The priest's words echoed, but they did not stick. My thoughts always returned to the interrupted gesture, to the pen that did not reach my fingers. In 50-odd years of life, I had signed contracts, raised children, buried my own parents. It was not fragile. I never was. But there, dressed in black, with swollen eyes, I became too convenient to ignore. Grief had turned me into justification. And everyone seemed comfortable with that. When the funeral was over, people quickly dispersed, as if there was an invisible schedule to meet. Quick hugs, empty promises of future visits, automatic words. My son approached me again and told me to go home to rest. He said he would take care of everything. All that, I wanted to ask. But I didn't ask. I was still trying to understand when I had ceased to be part of the everything. I got into the car feeling a tiredness that didn't come from crying, but from the feeling of having been pushed out of my own history. And that scared me more than death. At home, the silence seemed greater than before. The walls held memories that no one could sign for me. I sat at the kitchen table, still in my black coat, and stared at my hands. They were the same hands that had sustained that family for decades. The same hands now considered too unstable to hold a pen. I remembered the lawyer's look, my son's tense smile, the collective relief when I backed down. They didn't argue with me. They decided for me. And they did it with a frightening naturalness. That night, I hardly slept. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the briefcase being pulled away. I saw my name being treated as a detail. The feeling was not one of anger yet, but of something deeper and more corrosive, the realization that I had been diminished without consent. Grief had left me vulnerable, yes, but not incapable. Even so, I was labeled as someone who needed to be spared the truth. The problem is that the truth always finds a way to appear. And I felt that she was already knocking on the door. I got up before the sun and prepared coffee as I did every day. The habit anchored me. As the water boiled, I made a silent decision. I was going to find out what was in that document. Not to confront anyone yet, not to fight, but to understand. I deserved to understand. It didn't matter how hard they tried to convince me otherwise. That interrupted signature was not just bureaucracy. It was a symbol. A warning that something had been done without me. And I wasn't willing to accept that in silence. That day, still not knowing exactly what they had done, I realized that the funeral had not been just a farewell. It had been the perfect scenario. While I was crying, others were planning. While I buried someone I loved, they also buried my voice. But what they didn't know, what no one there seemed to consider, was that I was always stronger when they underestimated me. And, even without realizing it, in that moment when they prevented me from signing, they had awakened something that I had spent my entire life keeping in balance, the certainty that I was not invisible. I never was. The morning after the funeral, I woke up with the feeling that something was still happening, even in silence. It wasn't just his absence from the house, but a strange presence, as if decisions kept being made somewhere I didn't have access to. I picked up the phone a few times, thought about calling my son, but I always gave up before the first ring. There was something about the way he had looked at me the day before that was holding me back. It was not a concern. It was calculation. And this perception began to settle in me in an uncomfortable way. When I finally left home to solve simple things, such as going to the market, I realized that the city looked different. People who had known me for years greeted me with excessive care, as if I could break at any moment. Some looked away too quickly, others watched me in prolonged silence. It wasn't empathy. It was embarrassment. That hit me harder than I cared to admit. The feeling that something had been commented on, agreed, understood, and that I was the last to know. Later, my daughter stopped by the house. He sat at the table with me, drank coffee, talked about banal things, but there was an evident discomfort in every pause of the conversation. Whenever I mentioned the funeral, she changed the subject. Whenever I asked a more direct question, she answered with generalities. His eyes didn't stare at me for long. I knew that behavior. It was the same as when she was a child, when she hid something and believed that silence would protect her. But now, the silence served to distance me. I asked, simply, if there was anything I needed to know. She smiled, a short, tense smile, and said no, that I should just worry about resting. The word appeared again, like a rehearsed refrain. Rest. As if my mind had become a dangerous place. As if thinking was too much of an effort for someone my age. That excessive caution began to sound offensive. Not because of the form, but because of the intention behind it. In the afternoon, I received a call from the lawyer. He said he would pass some documents in the next few days, nothing urgent, nothing that required haste. He spoke to me as if he were treading on shaky ground, choosing every word so as not to overwhelm me. When I asked directly about the funeral document, there was a pause on the other end of the line. Short, but revealing. He replied that everything had been done in consensus. He did not specify consensus of whom. And I realized that, again, that consensus didn't include me. After the call, I sat on the couch and let reality settle in. It wasn't paranoia. It was exclusion. Something had been decided, and everyone acted as if it was normal for me not to participate. I began to mentally revisit the last few months, small conversations, suggestions made in a joking tone, comments about the future of the house, about making things easier. At the time, they sounded like care. Now, they began to fit in as preparation. And that hurt more than any document. At the end of the day, my son showed up unannounced. He said he wanted to see how I was. I walked around the house as if it were no longer entirely mine, observing, evaluating. He commented that perhaps it would be better for me to think about changes, something more practical. He spoke calmly, but there was a hidden haste in his words. When I asked him directly what had been decided, he took a deep breath and said that it was not the right time for difficult conversations. The right time, it seemed, was never when I was present. After he left, I cried for the first time since the funeral. Not for what I had lost, but for what they were trying to take from me. My autonomy. My ability to decide. My right to be heard. The morning had opened a crack, and they entered it with everything. I realized that it was not just about money or documents, but about control. They believed I would accept. That I would back off. That I would be grateful for someone to take care of everything. That night, I opened old boxes, looked for papers, contracts, anything that would help me understand my own life on paper. Each document was a concrete reminder that I had always been in charge. Nothing had been given to me. Everything had been built. The idea that I could no longer give an opinion on that was absurd. And yet, it was happening before my eyes. Not violently, but smiling, polite, treacherous. As I was organizing the papers, I felt something change inside me. It was not explosive anger, but a quiet steadfastness. A clarity that came late, but came whole. They were counting on my tiredness, my sadness, my age. They were counting on the fact that I wouldn't make any noise. What they didn't count on was that I always knew how to observe. He always knew how to wait. And above all, I always knew how to recognize when they were trying to decide my fate without asking me for permission. The fact that you've chosen to stay here and hear this story so far says a lot about who you are. What follows isn't just a personal account, it's a silent truth that many people live but few have the courage to face. If you believe that these stories need to continue to be told, subscribe to the channel and support so that secrets like this do not remain silent. I spent the next few days watching more closely than ever. He didn't ask too many questions, he didn't confront anyone directly. I just listened. It was amazing how, when they believed I was too distracted by the pain, people spoke freely around me. Loose comments, half-finished sentences, suggestions disguised as concern. Everything was accompanied by the same justification: at this stage of life, it is better not to stress. I listened to it as if listening to a sentence being constructed little by little, word by word. I began to realize that the image of fragility had not emerged now. It had been drawn for years, in a subtle, almost careful way. First, small decisions made without consulting me. Then, opinions ignored at family gatherings. Then unsolicited advice on rest, simplification, detachment. Always with affection, always with a smile. I myself had accepted many of these interferences, believing that they were gestures of love. Only now did I see how much that narrative weakened me in their eyes. I remembered situations where I tried to disagree and was quickly interrupted. "You don't have to worry about that," they said. "Let us solve it." At the time, it seemed like kindness. Today, it sounded like training. A slow conditioning so that I got used to not deciding. Not to be questioned. To trust blindly. It wasn't just about saving myself the effort, it was about getting out of control. And I had collaborated, without realizing it, out of fatigue, out of habit, out of love. My son was the most skilled in this role. He always knew how to use the right tone, the right expression, the exact dose of concern. When I talked about future plans, he diverted the conversation to safety. When I mentioned changes, he responded with stability. Always positioning myself as someone who needed to be protected from herself. He never called me incapable, but he treated me as if I was always one step away from becoming one. This subtlety was what made it all the more difficult to confront. There was a day when he commented, almost absent-mindedly, that I no longer had the same energy as before. The phrase echoed in me for hours. Not because it was completely false, but because it was used as an invisible argument. As if less energy means less right, less voice, less autonomy. I was getting older, yes. But growing old was not disappearing. And yet, that's how they began to treat me, as someone in the process of gradual erasure. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that the betrayal didn't start at the funeral. The funeral was just the final stage of something that had been rehearsed for a long time. They just took advantage of the moment when I was emotionally exposed to make official what they already considered normal. There was no meeting to decide if this was fair. They just decided it was convenient. And convenience, when it comes disguised as care, is one of the cruelest forms of betrayal. I began to feel ashamed, not of them, but of myself. Shame for having believed that love always manifests itself as protection. Shame for having confused silence with peace. But this shame soon gave way to something more productive, lucidity. There was no point in denying what was happening anymore. They saw me as fragile because it made everything easier. It made it easier to decide for me. It made it easy to ignore my will. It made it easier to move forward without guilt. In a seemingly innocent conversation, my daughter mentioned that maybe I would be better off living in a smaller place. He said this as if suggesting changing a sofa. He didn't ask if I wanted to. He just presented it as something logical. At that moment, I was sure that it was not a single isolated decision. It was a complete package. My house, my possessions, my rhythm, my voice. Everything was being reorganized without my having been consulted. And everyone seemed to think that was reasonable. That night, I sat in front of the mirror for a long time. I observed my face, the marks of time, the tired eyes. I didn't see fragility there. I saw history. I saw resistance. I saw someone who survived losses, changes, new beginnings. The image they had created of me did not correspond to reality. It was a convenient version, shaped to serve their interests. And for the first time, I felt a real desire to dismantle that version. I decided that I would not ask permission to understand what was happening. He would not wait for the right moment, that never came. The fragility they invented no longer represented me. If they were going to treat me as incapable, they would have to sustain it in the face of difficult questions. I still didn't know exactly how I was going to do it, but one thing was clear: I would no longer participate in my own silent exclusion. And that was the first step I really took, even without anyone noticing. The envelope arrived on an ordinary afternoon, left in the mailbox as if it were just another overdue bill or forgotten advertisement. The letterhead caught my attention immediately, not because of the content I was still unaware of, but because of the uncomfortable feeling of familiarity. I recognized the name of the law firm even before opening. I held the envelope for a few seconds, taking a deep breath, as if my body already knew that something would come out of it that would change the way I saw everything. It was not fear. It was confirmation. I opened it slowly, sitting at the kitchen table, in the same place where I had always organized my life. The document was objective, cold, full of terms that seemed carefully chosen so as not to arouse emotions. He spoke of changes, transfers, authorizations. My name appeared there, several times, as the protagonist of decisions that I never remembered having made. My heart raced, not out of confusion, but out of indignation. There was no doubt about it, it hadn't passed through my hands. I had never seen that roll before. I read it again, more slowly, line by line, as if I could find an explanation hidden between the words. Dates caught my attention. Some were before the funeral. Others coincided exactly with that day. My stomach twitched as I realized that everything had been arranged in advance, just waiting for the right moment to be executed. The moment when I would be too vulnerable to question, too vulnerable to sign, too vulnerable to prevent. What hurt me the most was not the content itself, but the naturalness with which it was done. There was no hesitation in the text, no hint of doubt or extreme urgency. It was a solid, structured plan, thought out calmly. This meant that no one there acted on impulse. No one made decisions in a hurry because of the pain. They just took advantage of pain as a tool. And this realization crossed me in a silent but profound way. I picked up the phone and called the lawyer. When I mentioned the document, his tone changed slightly. He remained polite, but now there was caution. He said that everything had been done for my good, that I had agreed in previous conversations. I asked when, exactly, I would have agreed. There was a pause that was too long. He replied that there were witnesses. He did not name names. He didn't have to. I already knew who they were. I hung up feeling a mixture of anger and clarity. There was no administrative error. There was no confusion. There was a choice. They chose to go on without me. They chose to decide what was best for my life without asking if I agreed. And they did so with the comfortable certainty that I would accept. After all, that's what I've always done. I accepted interference, suggestions, decisions from others. But now, there was a clear limit. And he had been overtaken. I spent hours with that document on the table, observing my printed, clean, perfectly reproduced signature. It was not faked, technically. It was authorized by old powers of attorney, by legal loopholes that I never imagined would be used against me. I had trusted too much. That was the hardest truth to swallow. I was not deceived by strangers, but by people who knew exactly my weaknesses and knew how to exploit them. When my son called that night, I didn't answer. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I needed to hear my own voice first. I needed to understand what I felt before I allowed him to shape the narrative once again. For the first time, he did not want ready-made explanations. He wanted silence. A silence that would help me reorganize everything inside me. The pain was no longer just for the recent loss, but for the certainty that something had been stolen while I was crying. At that moment, it was clear that I could no longer pretend normality. The document was concrete proof that my exclusion was not perception, it was fact. And facts demand a response. I didn't know yet what mine would be, nor how far I would go. But one thing was decided, I would not allow that sheet of paper to define the end of my story. If they had written something without me, I would make a point of rewriting what was still within my reach. I folded the document carefully and kept it in a folder of my own. Not out of acceptance, but out of strategy. That was not the end. It was the real beginning of the confrontation, even if still silent. For the first time since the funeral, I felt something other than sadness. I felt firm. A calm but irreversible determination. They had acted believing that I would not react. And that was the most serious mistake they made. He came the next day, as if nothing had happened, bringing with him that artificial calm he always used when he wanted to control a situation. He entered without asking permission, looking around the house as if evaluating a space that will soon no longer be just a visit. He sat in front of me and asked how I was, but his eyes did not look for me. They stared at the table, at the window, anywhere but my face. That was more revealing than any confession. Those who avoid looking know exactly what they have done. I put the document on the table, without saying a word. I watched his reaction carefully, every micro-expression, every contained movement. He took a deep breath before even touching the paper, as if he already knew what was there. He showed no surprise. Just tiredness. A tiredness that did not come from guilt, but from inconvenience. It was as if my discovery had derailed a well-organized plan, not as if it had exposed a betrayal. I asked him when he thought it would be appropriate to tell me. He replied that he was waiting for the right moment. That phrase came back once again, loaded with false prudence. He said that everything had been done thinking about me, my safety, my future. He spoke as if explaining something obvious, almost didactic. At no time did he apologize. At no time did he ask how I felt. He talked about me without talking to me. When I questioned why I wasn't consulted, he finally looked at me. It was quick, almost a reflex, and deflected again. She said that I was very fragile, that I could not stand difficult decisions at that moment. Hearing it from his mouth was like taking a slow but deep blow. It was not just a practical justification. It was an evaluation, a judgment on my ability. And it came from the very one I had raised to be honest with myself. I tried to explain that fragility is not synonymous with incapacity, that pain does not erase lucidity. He nodded, but his eyes said something else. It was condescension. He had already decided who I was in that scenario, and no words from me seemed able to change that. For the first time, I realized that our conflict was not about documents or goods. It was about power. About who had the right to decide the course of my life. He began to list benefits, as if he were selling an idea. Less worries, less responsibilities, more tranquility. He spoke as if he were doing me a favor. As if I should be thankful that I was taken out of the equation. That caused a lump in my throat, not of emotion, but of incredulity. It was my son. And he was treating me as a problem to be managed, not as a person to be respected. I asked him if he had considered the possibility of my disagreeing. He was silent for a few seconds too long. Then he replied that he thought it was unlikely. He said that I was always flexible. That word hurt more than any accusation. Flexible, in that context, meant moldable. It meant someone who gives in. Someone who does not confront. He built the entire strategy relying on this image. And when I realized this, something in me broke for good. I told him that I had not agreed with any of that. That he did not authorize decisions made in the shadows. My voice did not tremble, although inside everything was in motion. He tried to soften it, saying that now it was done, that going back would be complicated. I didn't say impossible. I said complicated. This choice of words gave me a little bitter satisfaction. Complicated is not definitive. Complicated can still be faced. When he got up to leave, there was a heavy silence between us. No hug, no attempt to get closer. Just distance. Before leaving, he said that I should think calmly, without emotion. As if it wasn't, in itself, deeply emotional. I sat there, watching the door close, certain that something had changed forever. Not just between us, but within me. That day, I understood that the most painful betrayal is not the one that comes with immediate screams or breakups. It is the one that presents itself as care. The one that uses love as a justification for control. My son believed he was doing the right thing. And perhaps he would never recognize otherwise. But I no longer needed his validation to know the truth. From that moment on, I was no longer just the fragile mother at the center of other people's decisions. I was the person who had been betrayed, and who was finally ready to act. After my son left, the house was strangely quiet, but it wasn't an empty silence. It was a silence full of answers that I had been avoiding formulating. I sat down again at the table and spread the documents out before me, as if they were pieces of a puzzle that was finally beginning to make sense. The more I reread, the clearer it became that none of this had been done in a hurry. It wasn't confusion, it wasn't carelessness. It was planning. And accepting this required more courage than I imagined. I started to review dates, names, old authorizations that I had signed years ago, in completely different contexts. Powers of attorney made out of trust, never thinking that they would be used to exclude me. Every detail pointed to the same uncomfortable conclusion. Someone had enough time to think, organize, and execute everything calmly. They knew exactly what they were doing. And they knew exactly when to do it. The funeral was not the beginning of the problem. It was just the moment chosen to put it into practice. The harshest perception was to understand that there was no isolated culprit. It wasn't just my son. There was a network of silent agreement, of people who preferred not to oppose because it was easier to go with the flow. Each one had their own personal justification, to avoid conflict, to spare suffering, to keep the peace. But deep down, they all benefited from the same idea, that I wouldn't react. This comfortable unanimity was what hurt me the most. I remembered comments made months earlier, almost jokingly, about organizing everything while there's still time. At the time, I thought it was exaggerated. Now, they sounded like rehearsals. Phrases thrown to measure my reaction, to test how far I would question. As I almost never questioned it, they moved forward. And they moved forward together. Betrayal, I realized, is rarely an impulsive act. It grows in the space left by the silence of others. There was a moment when I thought if I wasn't being too harsh, if maybe I was exaggerating. This doubt was short-lived. It was enough to remember the naturalness with which they prevented me from signing that document. No one asked. No one explained. They just decided. That scene did not go with error. Mistakes are accompanied by surprise, by attempts to correct. What I saw was relief. The relief of those who managed to do something without being questioned. The realization brought pain, but also a strange clarity. If it wasn't a mistake, then there was responsibility. If there was responsibility, there were choices. And if there were choices, I could also make mine. This line of reasoning gave me back something that had been taken away from me little by little, the feeling of agency. They had written part of the story without me, but not all of it. There were still blank pages. I decided to stop waiting for explanations that would never come honestly. There would be no spontaneous confession, no true apology. Those who act convinced that they are right rarely regret it. Instead, I started writing everything down. Dates, conversations, names, small contradictions. Not out of revenge, but out of lucidity. I needed to orient myself within that tangle of other people's decisions. I needed to know exactly where I was stepping. Interestingly, the more I accepted reality, the less anger I felt. Anger gave way to a quiet determination. There was no more room for naivety. That was not a confusing phase that would resolve itself. It was a rupture. And disruptions require positioning. Even if this position cost relationships that I spent my whole life trying to preserve. That night, I stared out the window for a long time, watching the almost empty street. I thought about how many times I accepted less than I deserved to keep everything running. I thought about how many times I confused love with concession. What was happening now was a direct consequence of that. It was not easy to admit, but it was necessary. Only by recognizing my own role could I change anything. When I finally went to sleep, I took with me an uncomfortable but liberating certainty. It had not been a mistake, and precisely for this reason I no longer needed to pretend that everything would be resolved with light talk. They had chosen to act without me. Now, I would choose how to respond. And for the first time since the funeral, I felt like I was taking back control, even though the road ahead was lonely and difficult. I discovered it by chance, like almost everything else in that process. A loose phrase said by someone who did not realize the weight of what he revealed. We were talking about trivial matters when they mentioned a conversation from that day, as if I had been present. I asked which day. There was a short silence, followed by a quick adjustment in tone, a thinly disguised attempt at correction. It was there that I was sure, they had gathered without me. And not just once. I began to mentally reconstruct the days before the funeral. Times when they didn't call me, visits that didn't happen, vague justifications. Everything began to fall into place with uncomfortable clarity. While I dealt with medical appointments, fatigue and everyday worries, they met to decide my future. I was not excluded by forgetfulness, but by choice. It was easier to talk without my presence. More efficient. More convenient. What hurt me the most was realizing that these meetings took place in the name of harmony. Avoid conflicts, avoid emotions, avoid my reaction. As if my opinion were an obstacle to be bypassed. I was always direct, I never liked decisions made halfway. They knew it. And instead of dealing with potential disagreements, they chose to take me out of the equation. They solved everything before I could say no. I remembered a cancelled lunch at the last minute, weeks before. They said it was just tiredness, mismatch of schedules. Now I saw it with different eyes. While I stayed at home, believing that everyone was busy, they organized. They decided. They planned. The funeral was just the moment when they put the plan into practice, with everything already lined up. I didn't participate because I was never invited to participate. There was something especially cruel about this observation. It was not a fight that drove us apart, nor an explicit disagreement. It was a silent, almost polite exclusion. They did everything the right way, with lawyers, witnesses, recorded conversations. Everything clean. All correct. Except for the essential detail, me. The person directly affected. The one that should be at the center of any decision. When I confronted my daughter about it, she tried to downplay it. He said he didn't want to overwhelm me, that I was going through a lot. I listened to that with a calmness that surprised me. Not because he agreed, but because he expected it. That narrative had been arranged. Everyone repeated the same words, as if they were reading a rehearsed script. It was comforting for them to believe that they were protecting me. I asked if, at any time, anyone had suggested including me. She hesitated before answering. He said that they even considered it, but thought it was better not to. That best echoed inside me for hours. Better for whom? Certainly not for me. Better to keep things under control. Better to avoid my resistance. Better to follow without having to justify difficult decisions. The exclusion was not careless. It was strategy. I realized then that it was not just a matter of material loss. It was a symbolic break. By meeting without me, they had decided that my presence was no longer needed. That my voice was expendable. That my story could be managed by others. This realization crossed me with a deep sadness, but also with a lucidity that could no longer be ignored. I wasn't dealing with an isolated mistake, but with a definite change in the way they saw me. I began to question how many other decisions had been made in the same way over the years, without me realizing it. How many times was I informed later, when everything was already resolved? How many times have I accepted ready-made explanations out of fatigue or because I wanted to keep the peace? The meeting without me was not the beginning. It was only the first time I could clearly see the pattern. That night, I understood that there was no point in expecting spontaneous inclusion. She wouldn't come. If I wanted to participate in my own life, I would have to take up space again. Even if it caused discomfort. Even if it was seen as an exaggeration. They had already organized themselves without me. Now, I would need to reorganize without their approval. And while that thought hurt, it also gave me back something essential, the certainty that I could still choose. It was not at the moment I read the document, nor when I confronted my son, that I felt the worst pain. It came later, more quietly, when I realized that I was gradually being erased. Not physically, not explicitly, but symbolically. My opinions are no longer requested. My decisions began to be communicated, not discussed. It was as if my existence had been reduced to an uncomfortable formality, something that needed to be managed with care but not respected. I began to notice how they talked about me in my presence. They used the third person, even with me sitting at the table. She's very tired, she needs fewer responsibilities, she doesn't like these things anymore. I listened to everything, with absolute clarity, while they pretended I wasn't there. That hit me in an almost surreal way. I was still alive, conscious, capable. Even so, she was treated as someone who no longer needed to be consulted. The pain came not only from the betrayal itself, but from the realization that my story seemed to have no more weight. Everything I built, everything I sustained, everything I sacrificed seemed to have been reduced to an irrelevant detail. They talked about the future as if I were a temporary obstacle. As if my role was already over. There was no open hostility, just a cold efficiency that hurt more than shouting. There was a moment when I found myself doubting myself. I wondered if maybe they were right, if maybe I really was too tired to handle it all. This doubt was the deepest blow. Not because it was true, but because it was planted with care over the years. The constant repetition of that image of fragility almost managed to convince me. Almost. And realizing this scared me more than any document. I started to revisit my own memory as a form of resistance. I remembered difficult decisions I made alone, moments when I was strong when no one expected it. I remembered crises overcome, losses faced, new beginnings that no one witnessed. None of this matched the fragile version they were trying to impose. That narrative was not mine. It was convenient for them. And that made all the difference. The most painful thing was to understand that, for many, my blackout was comfortable. It did not require confrontation, nor long explanations. All I had to do was move forward, assuming that I would accept everything with resignation. I've always been seen as someone who adapts, who gives in, who understands. This image, which once seemed like a quality to me, now became a trap. They counted on my understanding to justify their own omission. I began to feel a loneliness unlike any I had ever experienced. It was not the loneliness of loss, but that of being surrounded by people and yet not being considered. It was an active solitude, present in every interrupted conversation, in every decision announced without consultation. I was there, but I wasn't included. And this continuous exclusion began to tire me in a new, deeper way. Still, something began to change inside me. The pain of being erased brought with it an uncomfortable but necessary clarity. If I kept accepting that position, I would actually disappear. Not all at once, but gradually, until I became exactly the figure they had invented. And that idea caused me a different fear, not the fear of loss, but the fear of losing myself. It was at this point that I understood that it was not enough just to find out the truth. It was necessary to react to it. Not with outbursts or empty accusations, but with presence. With positioning. With clear limits. If they were willing to erase me, I would have to relearn how to occupy space. Even if it meant facing discomforts that I had avoided all my life. That night, I sat quietly and cried again, but in a different way. It wasn't a cry of helplessness, but of mourning for a version of me that allowed too much. I cried for the time when I confused love with submission. But as I wiped my face, I felt something firm settle in. I was still there. He could still speak. He could still decide. And from that moment on, I would no longer allow them to choose for me as if I had already left. At first, my voice really trembled. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because it had been a long time since I put myself at the center of difficult conversations. I had spent years softening sentences, choosing words so as not to cause discomfort, accepting other people's decisions to keep the peace. When I started talking again, I felt the weight of this old habit. Still, I did. Even with my throat tightened, even with my heart racing, I spoke. I started simply, asking direct questions. Questions that did not accept vague answers. When they said that something was already resolved, I asked by whom. When they used the word better, I asked who it was best for. At first, there was surprise. They were not used to seeing me insist. They tried to divert, minimize, change the subject. But I remained. For the first time, I did not back down from their discomfort. My son reacted with restrained impatience. He said that I was creating unnecessary tension, that this was not the time for conflicts. Hearing this confirmed something I already suspected. The right time for them would always be the one when I remained silent. Any attempt to position myself was seen as exaggeration, as emotional instability. I recognized the strategy immediately. It was the same one used at the funeral, just with different words. Even so, I continued. I started asking for copies of everything, writing down dates, demanding clarity. He did not raise his voice, he did not accuse directly. He just insisted on participating. This posture, apparently simple, caused more discomfort than any open confrontation. They didn't know how to deal with a firm presence that wouldn't let itself be led. The image of the frail woman was beginning to crack, and that made them insecure. There were times when I thought about giving up. To return to the comfortable silence that, although unfair, was known. Their resistance was exhausting. Impatient looks, long sighs, constant attempts to end the conversation. But something in me had already changed. Each time I spoke, even though I was afraid, I felt a small recovery of something that had been taken. My voice didn't have to be perfect. It just needed to exist. My daughter, in particular, seemed divided. At times, he supported me discreetly. In others, he repeated the discourse of, let's not complicate things. I could see the conflict in her, but I couldn't carry it for both of us anymore. For the first time, I understood that protecting my children from their own responsibility was not love. It was prolonging an imbalance that now cost me dearly. I needed to be clear, even if it made me less comfortable to live with. I started to set practical limits. He said he would no longer accept decisions made without my presence. That any conversation about my life would need to include me. I didn't ask permission. I informed him. There was silence. There was resistance. There were attempts at negotiation. But I kept it. Each limit imposed was a small act of courage that reminded me of who I still was. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. I realized then that my voice didn't need to be loud to be heard. It needed to be consistent. Every time I spoke, even shaking, it weakened the narrative of fragility they had built. They expected an explosion or withdrawal. They were not prepared for quiet firmness. This disarmed them more than any scream. Gradually, they began to listen to me, if only out of exhaustion. Still, there were days when I felt small again. The change was not linear. There were advances and setbacks. But even on the bad days, something remained different. I no longer accepted being erased without reacting. Even when her voice failed, the decision not to disappear was firm. This, in itself, was already a quiet victory. By the end of that week, I realized that I hadn't recovered anything concrete yet. No document had been altered, no decision reversed. But I had recovered something more fundamental. I was present. My voice, even trembling, took up space. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't just reacting to what they did to me. I was slowly taking back the right to exist out loud within my own life. It took me some time to accept that, behind all the care discourse, there was benefit. Not in the dramatic sense that we imagine when we think of betrayal, but in something more common and, therefore, more difficult to confront. Practical benefit, comfort, control. Their lives were simpler if I was treated as someone incapable of deciding. And this simplicity was too seductive to ignore. I started to observe more carefully who gained from each decision made without me. The too big house I was supposed to leave. The too heavy responsibilities that I shouldn't carry. Money too complicated for me to manage. All of this migrated, little by little, into the hands of those who claimed to be only helping. Helping, I realized, can be a dangerous word when it is not accompanied by consent. My son talked a lot about practicality, about efficiency, about avoiding future problems. At no time did I talk about what I wanted. It was as if my desires were a secondary detail, something that could be adjusted later. He benefited from the tranquility of deciding without being questioned, from the feeling of being in control. Perhaps he even believed that this made him responsible. But responsibility without listening is just well-dressed authoritarianism. Other family members benefited from the silence. They didn't need to take a stand, they didn't need to disagree with anyone. It was enough to agree on who seemed safer. The fragility they invented for me also served as an excuse for their own omission. She won't care, they said. And by saying this, they freed themselves from the burden of consulting me. It was too comfortable to assume that I would accept everything without resistance. There was also the emotional benefit. Deciding for me made them feel useful, important, necessary. Instead of dealing with their own powerlessness in the face of death and aging, they channeled everything into the control of my life. It was easier to organize my possessions than to deal with my own insecurity. I became, without realizing it, a project. Something to be managed. And that fed their sense of purpose. When I saw this clearly, I felt a strange mixture of sadness and relief. Sadness at realizing that my value had been reduced to the convenience I offered. Relief for finally understanding that none of it was personal in the affective sense. It wasn't hate. It was not direct rejection. It was everyday selfishness, disguised as care. And in a way, that made it all the more difficult to forgive. I confronted my son with this realization. He said he understood that his life was easier that way. He denied it immediately, as I expected. He said that everything was for me. But his answer came too quickly, too rehearsed. When I asked him what he would lose if I decided on my own, he didn't answer. Silence was the most honest answer I had so far. I realized that if I continued to accept that dynamic, it would become definitive. Not because someone was kicking me out, but because everyone would be too comfortable to change. The daily injustice is sustained like this. No one wants to be the first to give up their own benefit. And I had been convenient for too long. This understanding made me tired, but also more lucid. There was no point in expecting goodwill. It was no use appealing only to affection. I had to deal with real interests, even within the family. That didn't make me bitter. I became an adult within a relationship that had regressed to a dangerous imbalance. At the end of that day, I accepted something difficult. Not everyone was willing to give up what they had earned at my expense. Some would rather see me quiet again than face their own conscience. This realization hurt, but it also freed me from the expectation of spontaneous justice. If I wanted to recover something, I would have to fight for it with clarity and limits, not expecting immediate understanding. It was there that I understood that the real conflict was not just about what they had done, but about what I would allow from now on. They had already benefited from my silence. They would no longer benefit. Even if it meant colder relationships, more tense encounters, shorter conversations. My peace could no longer depend on the convenience of others. And this decision, silent and firm, marked the real beginning of the change. The attempt to silence me did not come abruptly. There were no shouts, no explicit threats. It came wrapped up in concern, in careful phrases, in suggestions said in a low voice. They said that I was wearing myself out too much, that this subject was not doing me any good, that I needed to preserve my emotional health. They used my well-being as an argument for me to stop insisting. It was an elegant strategy, difficult to confront without seeming ungrateful. My son started to call me more often, but the conversations had a specific tone. They always started with questions about how I was feeling, followed by subtle observations about how all of this could be avoided if I just trusted more. He said that I was creating unnecessary conflicts, that the family was worried about me. The word worried appeared as a shield. Any disagreement of mine was automatically interpreted as a sign of instability. There was a day when he suggested that I talk to someone, just to talk. I didn't say therapist, but I didn't say exactly what I wanted to say either. The suggestion was accompanied by an overly attentive, overly evaluative look. At that moment, I understood that it was not about support, but about containment. If I were seen as emotionally shaken, my claims would lose strength. My voice would easily be dismissed as the fruit of confusion or unresolved sadness. Other family members began to act in a similar way. They avoided touching the subject, changed the subject whenever I insisted. When I persisted, they came up with phrases like, "Let's leave this for later," or "This won't bring you peace." Peace, I realized, was defined as my obedience. As long as I remained silent, all would be well. The problem was never what they did, but the fact that I didn't accept it anymore. I felt, for a moment, the temptation to retreat. The fatigue was real. Standing firm took energy, and I was already dealing with too much loss. There were days when silence seemed more comfortable than constant tension. But every time I thought about giving up, I remembered the document on the table, the pen taken from my hand, the decisions made in the shadows. Giving up now would mean validating all that. In one particularly difficult conversation, my son said I was changing. He used the word as a criticism, not as a statement. She said that I have always been more flexible, more understanding. Hearing this confirmed something important. My move wasn't a problem for me, it was for them. I was no longer occupying the place that made everything easier. And that bothered them deeply. I realized then that the silencing was not only external. Part of it came from within, from years of learning not to bother, not to insist, not to seem difficult. Fighting against this required more than confronting others. It required confronting my own habits. It demanded accepting that I could be seen as harsh, ungrateful, exaggerated. And for the first time, I decided that this was an acceptable price. I started to end conversations when I noticed emotional manipulation. He didn't explain too much. I did not justify myself excessively. He only said that this matter was not closed. This posture caused immediate discomfort. Tense looks, long silences, sudden mood swings. But, curiously, it also began to change the dynamic. They could no longer lead me so easily. There were more direct attempts. Insinuations that I could lose support, that I would be alone if I continued like this. These suggestions did not come as a threat, but as a warning. Still, they were clear enough. And they hurt. No one likes to face the possibility of isolation, especially at a stage of life when company seems even more valuable. But I realized that company without respect was, in itself, a form of loneliness. At that stage, I understood that being silenced didn't just mean being quiet. It meant accepting a version of me that wasn't true. Refusing this silencing was a daily act, sometimes small, sometimes exhausting. But each time I resisted, something strengthened inside me. Even tired, even sad, I was no longer willing to disappear to make anyone's life easier. By the end of that week, I realized that the attempt to silence me had failed. Not because they had given up, but because I no longer recognized myself in the silence. My voice, even without screaming, was still there. Present. Uncomfortable. Hooray. And at that moment, that was all I needed to move forward. This part that comes now is the hardest to say out loud. Sharing it means exposing losses that I've spent years trying to protect, and accepting that some wounds never completely close. If you have come this far, it is because you understand that certain truths only survive when someone has the courage to say them. So I ask you, sign up, not as a support for me, but as a way to preserve voices that refuse to disappear. The confrontation took place without warning, in one of those family gatherings that should be quick and neutral. There was no formal summons, nor declared intention to discuss anything serious. Precisely for this reason, no one was prepared. I myself was not. Still, when I sat down at the table and noticed the looks exchanged, I understood that this would be another attempt to normalize what was never normal. And something in me decided that I wouldn't let it go. The conversation began with trivia, comments on the climate, future commitments, safe matters. I listened, but my body was attentive, tense in a different way. When they again mentioned plans that involved my life, changes, decisions, adjustments, without consulting me, I felt a deep weariness wash over me. It wasn't explosive anger. It was exhaustion. And it was this exhaustion that made me speak. I asked, in a firm voice, when exactly they had decided on all that. The silence that followed was heavy, almost embarrassing. No one immediately responded. Some looked away, others pretended to play with their cell phones. My son tried to intervene, saying that this was not the right time. I replied that it never seemed to be. And for the first time, no one had an immediate response. I began to speak without raising the tone, but without softening the words. He said he knew about the meetings held without me, the documents signed, the decisions made in the shadows. I didn't accuse with names, I didn't raise my voice. I just exposed the facts, one by one, as if placing objects on the table for everyone to see. With each sentence, I felt the environment change. Silent denial gave way to explicit discomfort. My son tried to justify it, repeating the discourse of care, concern, fragility. It was the first time I interrupted him. He said that care without consent is control. He said that fragility is not incapacity. I said that deciding for me didn't protect me, it just protected them from dealing with my disagreement. My hands trembled slightly, but my voice did not fail. That surprised me as much as they did. There were attempts to minimize, to relativize, to turn everything into a misunderstanding. But it was too late for that. What was being said was not new, it had just never been said out loud. I did not seek punishment, nor immediate reparation. He was looking for recognition. The recognition that it had been done to me, not by me. And this recognition was too expensive to be offered easily. My daughter cried silently. Someone said that no one wanted to hurt me. I replied that the absence of intention does not erase the impact. He said that I had been excluded, disregarded, diminished. Not as a mother, not as a relative, but as a person. And that this had consequences. The room was so quiet that it was possible to hear her own breathing. For the first time, I wasn't the one who felt small there. When I finished speaking, no one applauded, no one approached. There was no catharsis. Just a dense silence, full of unresolved things. And, curiously, this did not bother me. I no longer needed immediate approval. I just needed to have said it. I needed to have placed myself entirely in front of them, without asking permission, without hiding behind the fear of displeasing myself. My son finally spoke, saying that maybe they had made a mistake in the form. He did not say that they made a mistake in the decision. That was enough for me to understand the limit of that moment. Not all truths would be accepted at once. Not all wounds would be recognized. And everything was fine. I didn't need to solve everything there. He just needed to break the silence that sustained injustice. I got up from the table before the conversation dragged on to circular justifications. He said he would not accept any more decisions without my presence. That any future step would need to be discussed with me. It was not a threat, nor a request. It was a limit. And limits, I had learned, do not require consensus to exist. As I left, I felt a deep tiredness, but also a strange lightness. The confrontation was not planned, it was not perfect, it did not bring immediate solutions. But it was real. For the first time, I was not only the object of the decisions. I was a subject. And that, regardless of what came next, had already changed everything. After the match, there was a strange period of waiting. No one called me to discuss what was said, no one tried to resume the conversation directly. It was as if everyone needed time to reorganize their own narratives. I also had to. In the days that followed, I realized that facing the truth didn't necessarily mean reversing it. Some things, once done, do not go back. And accepting that was one of the hardest parts of the whole process. Some documents really couldn't be undone without bigger consequences than I was willing to face. Long, exhausting processes that would require emotional energy that I no longer wanted to deliver. Understanding this was not a sign of weakness, but of conscious choice. Not every battle needs to be won for the internal war to end. There were losses that I would have to carry with me, even after I had regained my voice. The relationship with my son never returned to what it was before. There was no definitive break, but something broke silently. Conversations became more careful, less spontaneous. He began to measure his words, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of wounded pride. I also measured mine. Not out of fear, but out of clarity. Some intimacies do not survive when trust is crossed in this way. My daughter approached at certain times, but always with caution. There was guilt in her gestures, and that made everything more delicate. I didn't remove her, but I didn't automatically acquit her either. I understood that each one deals with their own responsibility in a different way, and that not everyone is ready to face what they have done or allowed. This acceptance was bitter but liberating. It wasn't up to me to fix everything. I realized that some of what I had lost was not material, but symbolic. I have lost the illusion that family love is always protective. I lost the belief that good intentions are enough. These losses are not resolved with agreements or conversations. They settle in and change the way we see the world. It hurt to acknowledge that, but it also made me more honest with myself. There were days when I missed the old version of my family, even though I knew it was never exactly real. I missed the feeling of automatic belonging, the idea that I was safe just by being among my own. Regretting this was necessary. You can't rebuild anything without first acknowledging what has been lost. And some losses, I learned, do not ask for a solution, only mourning. At the same time, something unexpected began to emerge. A new space. Rather occupied by excessive concessions, by forced silences, by other people's expectations. This empty space was scary at first, but it soon proved fertile. For the first time in a long time, my decisions didn't have to be emotionally negotiated. I could choose without asking for approval. And this brought a strange, if incomplete, peace. I started to reorganize my life within the limitations that remained. I adjusted routines, made simpler choices, cut excesses. Not as a punishment, but as a new beginning. Every little decision I made by myself was a silent form of reassurance. I didn't need to recover everything to move forward. He only needed to recover the essential, the right to decide. I understood that the justice I imagined might never come the way I expected. There would be no great apologies, no full acknowledgement of the mistake. And accepting that was part of the maturity that experience imposed on me. The validation I was looking for would not come from them. It would have to come from me. And, surprisingly, that was enough. At the end of that period, I understood that there were losses that do not come back, relationships that change forever, confidences that are not fully recomposed. But I also understood that these losses do not define the end of everything. They define the beginning of something different, less idealized, less comfortable, but more true. And at that point, I was ready to take the next step, not to reclaim the past, but to build something new with what I still had left. Rebuilding my life was nothing grand or inspiring in the ordinary sense of the word. There were no dramatic decisions or immediate radical changes. It was a slow process, made up of small choices, almost invisible to those looking from the outside. And maybe that's why it was so profound. I didn't want to go back to the way I was before. That no longer served me. I needed to discover what could still be, within the new limits that reality had imposed. I started by reorganizing my routine. More my schedules, less explanations given out of habit. I learned to say no without justifying too much, something that had always seemed rude to me, but now it sounded necessary. I realized how much I had conditioned my life to the comfort of others. Every little change, choosing where to go, when to go out, who to talk to, was a quiet way to regain territory. It was not rebellion. It was presence. There were days when I felt like running back, resuming old agreements just to avoid the loneliness that sometimes appeared. Rebuilding requires crossing this initial void, and it scares. But every time I thought about giving in just so I wouldn't be alone, I remembered the cost of it. I remembered how much I had diminished myself to fit into spaces that no longer respected me. Honest loneliness, I realized, was less painful than the company that erased me. I started to take care of myself in a different way, not as someone who protects himself from the world, but as someone who reaffirms himself in it. I went back to activities that I had abandoned due to lack of time, or because I thought they were no longer for me. Long walks, unhurried readings, chosen conversations. Each simple gesture carried a new meaning. It was not a distraction. It was reconstruction. My relationship with my family stabilized in a less intense, less idealized place. There were no major reconciliations, no definitive breaks. Just a respectful, sometimes cold, but honest distance. I no longer expected them to fully understand me. I just hoped that they would respect my limits. And when that didn't happen, I walked away without guilt. I learned that distance can also be taken care of. I realized that rebuilding is not erasing what happened. The marks remain. The occasional distrust, the sadness that comes without warning, the memory of having been betrayed by the one I trusted the most. All of this still exists. But now these marks don't define me. They inform me. They became part of my story, not the center of it. There was a specific moment when I understood that I was no longer trying to prove anything to anyone. He did not need to demonstrate strength or exemplary independence. I just lived according to what made sense to me. This quiet freedom was the greatest gain of the whole process. It was not full happiness, but it was coherence. And this brought a tranquility that I didn't know before. I also learned to accept help differently. No longer as someone who hands over control, but as someone who chooses to share. That distinction changed everything. I didn't have to do everything on my own to be strong. I just needed to remain in charge of my decisions. This awareness allowed me to create new, more balanced, more honest connections. Over time, I began to realize that my identity was not tied to losses. I was more than the betrayed mother, more than the underestimated woman, more than the fragile figure they tried to impose on me. I was someone in reconstruction. And reconstructions don't follow straight lines. They advance, retreat, adjust. And that's okay. Rebuilding was not returning to the starting point. It was accepting that that point no longer existed. It was walking from what was left, from what was still possible, from what made sense now. And, even without guarantees, without promises of perfect endings, I realized that I was in a truer place than I had ever been. A place where my life was finally mine again. Time passed without official announcements of reconciliation or definitive breakup. Things simply settled into a new place, less comfortable, but more honest. The family continued to exist, but it no longer occupied the same emotional space as before. Conversations became more objective, meetings rarer. There were no formal requests for forgiveness, nor great acknowledgments of what was done. And surprisingly, that is no longer essential for me. I learned to accept that some people move on without revisiting their mistakes. Not out of open malice, but out of an inability to deal with the discomfort that the truth causes. I spent years believing that understanding would solve everything. Now he understood that understanding does not mean accepting. I can understand their motivations without allowing them to continue to define my life. My relationship with my son found a strange, almost protocol balance. There is respect, but there is no more naivety. We talk about the present, we avoid the past. He never directly touched on what happened, and I stopped waiting for him to play. Love remains, but now it walks alongside clear boundaries. It's not the bond one dreamed of, but it's what exists. And I learned to deal with it without falling apart. There were moments of unexpected sadness, days when everything seemed heavier than it should have been. The sense of injustice still appeared, silently, especially when I remembered the trust one had given without reservation. But those memories no longer paralyzed me. They came, stayed for a while, then left. I no longer fought against them. They were part of what I lived, not what I was now. I started to find satisfaction in simple things, not as those who conform, but as those who choose. Walking without haste, organizing the house in my own way, making decisions without explaining. Each daily gesture carried a new meaning. I didn't need to prove anything to anyone. My victory was not in regaining all that I lost, but in not allowing it to define me forever. I realized that the biggest gain of this whole experience was the relationship I rebuilt with myself. I started to trust more in what I feel, in what I perceive, in what I can no longer ignore. I don't underestimate myself like I used to. I don't surrender important decisions expecting others to take better care of me than I do. The woman who came out of this process is more cautious, yes, but also more whole. There was no applause, no public recognition. There was no clear moment of triumph. And that, somehow, made it all the more real. Life rarely closes cycles with dramatic gestures. Sometimes, it just goes on, letting us carry what we've learned. My learning came with pain, but also with a clarity that I never had before. Today, when I look back, I don't just think about the betrayal. I think about the moment when I stopped accepting being diminished. I think about the pen taken from my hand and how that gesture awakened something I had silenced for years. They thought my grief made me weak. They didn't realize that it was exactly there that I woke up. My ending is not perfect, nor happy in the traditional sense. It's bittersweet. There are losses that remain, relationships that will never be the same. But there is also something solid, built with calm and awareness. I move forward without illusions, but with dignity. And, after all, that's more than enough. If this story touched you on any level, please share this video. Not because it's about me, but because it speaks of patterns that are repeated in many families and continue to be treated in silence. Sharing is an act of solidarity. It can reach out to someone who needs to realize that they are not alone and that there is still room to react. I'm going to stay here reading every comment, really. Tell me, from which city or country are you watching, and what about this story stayed with you? Your words matter more than you think to me.